want to start with an odd story in a way. This past week I met someone over at the Parkwood Diner, and I wound up sitting at the counter by myself for a few minutes, and when I did, the waiter came out to the fella who was sitting to my right, at the counter. You were always close beside each other, and said, here is your lentil soup. And I looked down because I'm middle of the week, mid-sermon prep. I'm thinking about lentil soup a whole lot and this red stuff. And so I'm not a lentil soup eater. I don't pay much attention to lentil soup. I can't even tell you what it looks like. I know now. I kept looking at this guy's lentil soup, and he was kind of spooning it a little bit, getting it to cool off. And indeed, it was red stuff. Thick red stuff. And for a moment, because you go to these places when you're deep into something like this, I thought, I want to tap this guy on the shoulder and say, do you know the story of lentil soup and what it's all about? Do you know that that's the centerpiece of a reading for this week in the church where I'm going to preach, and I'm going to talk about lentil soup? And then I came to my right mind. I thought, this guy would think I am nuts. And they would be ushering me out of the Parkwood Diner and saying, don't ever come back again. Thank you very much. But the story's kind of crazy for us, isn't it? I mean, thousands of years later, we hear this story of two twins that are striving in their mother's womb, so much so that she's disgusted with it and wondering what it's all going to lead to. And here's the word from God in her prayers that these are two great nations striving within her, and that there's going to be all of these rivalries. And there's this story of how these two are just rivalries even before they're rivals, even before they are born, and even in the process of birth, one is grabbing the other's heel, trying to pull him back. It's crazy stuff, right? What's it got to do with the activity of God in the world and the way God acts and brings about God's promises? How can we understand it? It's crazy stuff. And even this story of the stew, one comes in, the rivalry continues. One is the favorite of mom and one is the favorite of dad. Thank goodness each had a favorite, that it wasn't complete rejection by either. But even the story that we have before us today of one coming in, Esau, coming in from a day of hunting and being famished, and his brother making the stew and him smelling that delicious red stew that I saw, that red stuff. And being willing to give up his birthright for that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? And yet, if you've ever been in some extended meetings where there's a lot of rivalry, have you ever seen people make bad decisions? In those situations where they're in such a rivalry that it doesn't matter anymore. If that person says X, I'm saying Y. Whether Y makes sense or not, I'm saying Y. And it's not so much of whether it's a good decision or a right decision. It's a matter of pride, isn't it? We get all caught up in our pride and I'm going to win, no matter what. And that's how the story unfolds. And yet God takes it and uses it. Like Rita was saying in the children's chat, God takes that mess and redeems it. God takes that messy family and uses them to bless all the nations of the world. For it is through this family that we receive the promise of God. through this family that Jesus comes. Isn't that the way God is, though? Redeeming the messes of our lives, redeeming the mess of our world, redeeming the rivalries that unfold. God's grace just spills out all over the place. I like that version of interpreting the story of the parable of the seeds. When you plant seeds, are you like this sower? Just tossing it about everywhere? Or are you someone who very carefully lays those seeds out to make sure they're in a row and that each one has the best possible chance of sprouting and growing and bearing fruit? Not so with the seeds of God's grace and God's realm and God's work. They just get tossed about everywhere. They're tossed on the path. They're tossed in the thorny soil with all the thorns. They're tossed in the rocks. They're tossed in the good soil. God's grace is just everywhere. And God brings fruit. And God does good things. Sometimes in our lives when things are conflicted and divided and struggling, we can fool ourselves. Well, we can get depressed and begin to think that God must not be here, that God can't bring good from these things. The good news of the gospel is just the opposite. No matter how confused and mixed up and difficult and divided a church session might be, I'm often surprised to see the ways God is bringing good even in that moment. No matter how broken a family may appear to be, God seems to bring some good things out of it. God is at work in all of that. Today we ordain and install new officers, and part of where I'm coming from today is just a reminder, to all of you who are officers in the church and to all of us who are members in the church is not a perfect group of human beings. We are a mixed up bunch. And we all have our faults and our quirks, and we all have our differences. And when those differences manifest themselves, that's not an indication that God is not present with us. In fact, it may be in the conversation and discussion that goes on in those differences that God is most at work. God's grace abounds, even in our divisions. I suspect that may be something we need to pray for in these days. Eyes to see where God is at work. Hearts that are open to God's grace in all of our world. Let us pray. Gracious God, open us to the abundance of your grace and love, and to the surprising ways in which you work. As we sing our Amen, as we